Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining our second listening session, part of our Coalition Advocacy Day. I'm James Dold, the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. We're really excited for you all to join this session focused on the need to treat children like children in the criminal justice system. Real quick, just a couple of logistics as we get started here for staffers from other offices as well as media, folks from the media who might be participating today. We're going to ask that you hold any questions that you may have during the panel discussion for the end, at which point we will make sure that there's about 5 or 10 minutes left for you to raise your hand, take yourself off mute, and ask questions of the panelists directly. In between that time, please just keep track of your questions. You can also put a question in the chat box as well, and we'll be sure to read it in case it's an easier way for you to an easier way for you to ask your question specifically. So I know we're running a little bit late, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce good friend and incredible advocate. Is an amazing human being, the director of advocacy at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in California, my good friend, Michael Mendoza. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. Once again, my name is Michael Mendoza, and I'm the Director of National Advocacy with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition based in Los Angeles, California.
And I am Eric Alexander. I serve as Senior Advocate for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth based in Washington, D.C.
And for the next hour, my colleague Eric and I will be moderating a discussion titled Treat Kids Like Kids: Why Congress Must Prioritize Criminal Justice Reform for Children. And on this discussion, we will be featuring individuals who were incarcerated as children, individuals that were harshly sentenced who will share what life was like growing up during the tough on crime era and what it was like to be tried as adults. People and individuals who were once sentenced to die in prison who have now re-entered back into society some decades later, all here to share with you why we should treat children differently.
We will also discuss the bipartisan effort underway in Congress, a package of legislation supported by research and brain science with a clear message. Children are different from adults and must be treated differently in the criminal justice system. These bills, authored by Congress members Bruce Westerman of Arkansas, Karen Bass, and Tony Cárdenas, both from California, will align the federal government with human rights standards.
These bills are based on the amazing work that most of the organizations that we work with in this coalition have done on a state level. Organizations like the Human Rights for Kids, the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, First Focus Campaign for Children, Human Rights Watch, and so many other amazing organizations across the country. I mean, here I am sitting on the West Coast in California, and my colleague Eric on the East Coast. All of these organizations are focusing and fighting for children in the criminal justice system. And that is because over the years, too little attention has been paid to the most vulnerable casualties of mass incarceration in America, and that's children. Since the late 1980s and early 1990s, many states moved to pass harsh sentencing and tough on crime laws that impacted children and made it easier for children to be tried as adults. And I should know because I was one of them. When unfortunately at the very young age of 15 in 1996, I made the worst decision of my life by committing a gang-related homicide that took the life of another young man. I was tried as an adult, sentenced to 15 to life in prison, and grew up in adult prisons for about 17 years until policy saved my life and allowed me to prove that I was no longer that 15-year-old kid anymore. And by 2010, an estimated 139,000 children were housed in adult prisons and jails across the United States. Policymakers were driven by the super predator myth, now debunked, which we now know better of.
The policies that have resulted from this rhetoric have made America a global outlier. Michael, we stand as the only country in the world to sentence children to life in prison without any possibility of parole. We've always known that youth are different from adults. However, this doesn't apply when the same youth become involved in the criminal justice system. The Supreme Court has emphasized that youth matters in the criminal legal system, and through its cases has made several rulings on this issue. They concluded that it should be reserved and applied only in cases where the individual is determined to be incorrigible. They went on to add that youth should be offered reasonable opportunities for release. This speaks to what we're talking about here today, a legislative package that creates more fair and age-appropriate protections and practices for children who come into contact with the federal criminal justice system, and that seeks to offer a much-needed layer of protection by considering that youth have the greatest capacity for change and should be offered a second chance to enter society. Here's an overview of the bills.
The first bill is authored by Congressmember Tony Cárdenas. It is HR 2834. This bill focuses on protecting kids at the point of entry and arrest, and simply makes sure that we protect the constitutional rights of our children by ensuring that their parents are notified if they are being arrested and prior to interrogation. It ensures that a child has access to an attorney to make sure that they understand what their rights are before even waiving them. Approximately 90% of young people who waive their Miranda rights, most kids under 18, do not understand why these rights matter.
Next, I'll discuss the Bass and Westerman bills. But first, I'll add that I haven't always had the good fortune to serve in the capacity as senior advocate. Free now for 18 years, I was once one of the children that these type of policies would allow a second chance. And I am very similar to other youth sentenced to lengthy sentences around the country. Traumatic experiences in our early childhoods, like me witnessing the abuse of my mother by an alcoholic and abusive father, are what ultimately put me and them on a path to prison. Charged according to the felony murder rule, tried as an adult at age 17 and faced life without parole, I understand the need for legislation like HR 2908, presented by Congresswoman Karen Bass, will help ensure that we create a more trauma-informed and age-appropriate accountability measures for youth who come in conflict with the law. There are 5 points of contact with the criminal justice system that HR 2908 addresses. The first is children in juvenile court. HR 2908 establishes a minimum age of criminal culpability for children at 12. Children in adult court. This bill increases the minimum age for a child to be tried as an adult from 13 to 16. The juvenile justice system is the appropriate place for children between 12 and 17 to be held accountable. And children younger than 16 should never face the prospect of being tried and sentenced as an adult based on the developmental differences between these younger and older teenagers. The third point is children in adult jails and prisons. HR 2908 prohibits the placement of children in adult jails and prisons and requires data collection on youth who come into the federal justice system. Placing kids in adult jails and prisons is dangerous and inhumane, to say the least. Children and the felony murder rule. HR 2908 eliminates the felony murder rule for children. Under the felony murder rule, youth are automatically liable for first-degree murder if the death occurs during the commission of certain crimes, even if that youth did not kill, aid in the killing, or intend for a murder to occur. This provision will ensure that youth who do not kill or intend to kill anyone are held accountable for their action to participate in the underlying felony in an age-appropriate manner. The last point of HR 2908 is treatment and services for vulnerable children. This bill establishes a grant block program for children and services for children under 12 and child victims of commercial sexual exploitation. We must provide children who have experienced severe trauma and who become system involved at young ages with the wraparound services and care that they need. This provision will help states do that by creating a block grant program to encourage collaborative support services for dual status youth and child welfare in the juvenile justice system. Next, we have HR 2858 presented by Congressman Bruce Westerman. This reform will retroactively end life and de facto life without parole by giving individuals convicted of crimes as children the ability to petition a judge for sentencing review and modification after serving 20 years. It will give judges the ability to depart from mandatory minimums when sentencing children up to 35% away from the minimum, and protect child sex crime victims from harsh sentencing when they commit acts against their violent abusers. Now back to you, Michael, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Eric. And now I have the privilege of introducing some amazing individuals that have not only been arrested as children, but tried as an adult, survived adult prison, experienced what life was like in adult prisons, including the violence, the trauma, the difficulty of even accessing rehabilitation. And they're all here right now at this very moment to not only share their stories in service of others and to give back, but to help change hearts and minds, and to, again, reiterate why we need to prioritize federal legislation for children. So I just want to welcome everybody onto the screen and allow everybody to just introduce yourselves and share a little bit about yourselves before we move on into the questions. We'll start with you, Jerome.
Hey, good morning. My name is Jerome Dixon. I am an Anti-Recidivism Coalition board member, executive board member. I'm very honored to be present on this discussion. I'm eager, I'm excited, and I'm ready to have a good discussion.
Thank you, Jerome. I'm really looking forward to the questions that we have lined up for you. But I just want to make sure everybody introduces themselves quickly. We also have Abd'Allah, we have Jarret and Oscar, all amazing individuals. Can you all quickly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, Abd'Allah Latiff, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate with you all in this discussion, and I'll get into my background when we open up into panel discussion. Thank you much.
How you guys doing? My name is Jarret Harper. I am an ambassador for Represent Justice, as well as a social impactor at Friends at Work. I'm also the founder and executive director of Better Days. Our mission is to end the foster care to prison pipeline, the same pipeline that I traveled through at the young age of 17 months old when I was first placed into the foster care system. By the time of my incarceration at the age of 16, I had experienced 48 different foster homes. So the pipeline for me is very real, it was very palpable. And it's something that I still have to cope with and live through as I reflect on the path and the journey that I've traveled as a child all the way up into the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Oscar Canales. I am a youth fellow with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, as well as a youth leader within the Los Angeles Youth Uprising Coalition. Looking forward to this discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you everyone so much for being here, for being willing to share your stories and experiences. Jerome, I want to go back to you with our first question. And Jerome, being a great friend of mine and colleague, and also a board member of our organization, I know your story very well, Jerome. Where at the young age of 17, you experienced one of the harshest interrogations for the longest period of time at such a young age. And we know that children are often forced to confess and are convicted of crimes that they did not commit, such as yourself. When you were taken into custody, did you understand Miranda warnings that police gave you, or know the importance of your constitutional rights at that time? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. So I was 17, in the wrong place, wrong time, and I was placed in an interrogation room, and I was held in that interrogation room for 25 hours. To answer your question, I did not understand at all what my Miranda rights were. And when my Miranda rights were read to me in the 25th hour, I still didn't comprehend what they were saying. It was a very traumatic experience for me to have to endure such, harsh questioning at a young age. And I'm sure if I would have had a stronger mindset to comprehend what was going on, I'm sure that the outcome would have been different tremendously.
Sorry you experienced that, Jerome. Before I move on to the next question, I would like to ask the panelists if they would like to speak to the question of the importance of Miranda rights, understanding the Miranda rights.
Yes, I can actually speak towards the the Miranda rights. They were said to me, they were read to me, but it's not something that I understood at that age. I was very impressionable, and I was underdeveloped. I was still in high school. So although I heard the words, I didn't understand the context of what my rights were. So I carelessly gave them away because I didn't understand my rights, and I didn't understand what else to do except to incriminate myself. So these package of bills are right for this moment, and they were right when I went through the system, because if they were in place, I would have received the care and the mercy that I deserved and that I should have been afforded.
Any other responses before we move on? If not, the next question is for Abd'Allah. Abd'Allah, you were sentenced under the felony murder rule, which resulted in a life sentence without parole. Can you tell us what it felt like at sentencing and what it was like being incarcerated in an adult jail and adult prison as a child?
Yes, thank you. Thank you first for the question and the opportunity to respond to that. And now I would also take the liberty for a more formal introduction of myself. As you mentioned, at 17 years of age, I was participatory with a 21-year-old adult in a snatch and one unarmed robbery, where the victim was shoved through the floor, suffered a fractured femur, and died 18 days later after complications, medical complications from a procedure to correct the fractured femur. I was charged as an adult with felony murder, as was my adult accomplice, and ultimately offered a plea to a lesser sentence and a lesser charge. My parents prohibited me from accepting that offer, and unbeknown to myself and to my parents, I was found guilty and sentenced to a mandatory term of life without possibility of parole. And I didn't learn that I would face a life sentence, that was a thing, that it was possible, until after the judge pronounced guilt. So that was the very first time that I myself heard that, and my parents became aware of that as well. So in terms of what that was like, as you might imagine, under those circumstances, just extremely distraught. One, to learn that I would be forced to disappear from society with the expectation of dying in prison and spending the rest of my life in prison, and not fully understanding what that would entail and what that would mean, just knowing that essentially my life was over before it ever got an opportunity to begin. And so there was a confluence of emotion that ranged from anger, frustration, disappointment, confusion, and outrage at myself for participating in such an offense, at my parents for prohibiting me from accepting the plea, at the judge for going forward and sentencing me, knowing the reasons why the plea offer elapsed, and for the prosecutor who decided to prosecute me as an adult. And after the plea lapse, still went forward with a consequence that only could result in a mandatory life without possibility of parole sentence. And so with all of those mixed emotions going into a prison environment, where not only do we speak about and see and witness wanton brutality and violence and the just living conditions that attend confinement, not just the restrictions in terms of razor wire bars and fences and guards and all of those things, but hopelessness and despair and indifference to human suffering. The emotional toll is often as bad, if not worse, than the actual physical violence. And as a child, the vulnerability that we all face from some people who have predatory tendencies, just simply because they too went to jail with the expectation of dying in there, and many in those very early days had this mindset that they're going to be what the courts and society told them they were. And so some people acted off of those impulses of being particularly violent, being particular monsters and predatory. And the people who they tended to prey on was the younger folk, children, in fact. So experiencing all of those different things certainly had a tremendous and traumatic impact. And so we could get into some further details later on in the question. Thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you so much, Abd'Allah, for sharing that. I'm going to turn to you next, Jarret. You've also dealt with a great deal of trauma as a child. You navigated through the foster care system and eventually ended up standing for a judge that basically sentenced you to die in prison with a juvenile life without parole. And to the audience, that meant that he was never going to go home. So can you tell us a little bit about that, Jarret, and what it was like living through that hopelessness and just going through the adult system?
Yeah, man. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that question. First off, the most honest response is I'm still going through it. I still live with that experience because it's at the forefront, because it was more of my life than I've been living today. A little less than 2 years ago, I was released from the California State Prison after surviving a death sentence of life without the possibility of parole plus 10 years. That's after going through 2 trials where the district attorney continued to push for death. They knew that I was a foster child. They knew that my victim was also my predator. He was molesting me. He molested me and my younger brother starting at 6 up until I was 13 years old. He then did the same thing to my younger brother. And that it damaged me. He was the second person to abuse me as a foster child. I had already been through multiple foster homes. I didn't have parents. I didn't have anyone that looked like me. I'm 6'6". I didn't have any value because I felt unfinished. I didn't know where I came from. I didn't have any attachment to my humanity. So when I took actions into my own hand and responded the way that people were responding to me with anger and violence, I was re-traumatized by our penal system and I was cast away as a throwaway. The experience inside of prison was horrific. But at the same time, it was very eerily close to what I had already experienced as a foster child. So for me, it was a continuation of the way in which I was already living my life. This was a part of my normal. This is what God had set up for me, at least in my childlike thinking. I thought that when the judge told me that I was irredeemable and that I should never walk amongst society again, I knew that he was wrong, but the little boy in me didn't know how to express that I was not the worst. I was actually the most harmed and I needed the most help. And it wasn't until I went through my journey, in prison, in a maximum security, a level 4 prison out in California, that I tapped into myself and the true word of God and connected that to myself and my life and found value. And I found value in myself. And that enabled me to move forward and push forward and reject the notion or idea that I was an adult because the judge was charging me as an adult. I knew that you could not make me an adult because I was a child. I knew that I had to grow into an adult. And as I grew into an adult, I became the kind of person that I was always supposed to be a kind, loving, caring individual that understood that the rent that I pay for being here on earth is service to other people. That idea, that mindset, that motto is what I put at the forefront as I led with my heart through my incarceration. And it ultimately allowed other folks to provide me with mercy. It allowed John Legend and Ty Stocklorius and Brian Stevenson and all these advocates to come in. However, it made it seem as though I was exceptional or I was rare, but instead I am exceptional because I'm a human being like everyone else. But I also know that I'm a reflection of the other folks who are in prison and who have experienced trauma. That is a lot of what I experienced. And again, today, as I lead to fix the pipeline that I traveled through, it's a heavy burden because there's so many children who are in the grips of the system as we speak today. At this very moment, children are in their grips of trauma, suffering, and the thoughts of committing suicide while incarcerated. So today I advocate for mercy and second chances. And in my case, and in a lot of foster children's case, a first chance, because the people, that's what the court said, the people of the state of California charged Jarret Harper. It wasn't until I aged and grew and I realized that the people are my parents. The people should never charge me. The people should never throw me away because I belong to you. You guys were my parents. Yeah.
So sorry that happened to you, and welcome home. I'm glad that you're here. Now sharing your talent with society at large. My next question is for you, Oscar. Your experience is unique to this group of panelists in that you didn't experience transfer into adult court and eventually experience adult prison. Can you share what it was like for you being arrested as a child and your experience in the juvenile justice system?
Yes, thank you. Thank you everybody for sharing on this call and showing vulnerability. Yes, I was very fortunate to be one of the very few youth in Los Angeles County that did not get tried as an adult. I was 14 years of age. I was very young, very immature. I was in the foster care system. So with Jarret speaking, it brought a lot of old memories and the sense of feeling very, that the state will protect you no matter what, even though they fail. I did get arrested at the age of 14. I found my fitness. I got sentenced to juvenile life. So that meant that I had the possibility of paroling before the age of 25. As I said earlier in this call, I was very fortunate to be one of the very few youth to be able to get sentenced as a juvenile. Many of my juvenile friends that I was incarcerated in juvenile hall did not get that same opportunity. I was surrounded in a table with kids facing 80 years to life, 120 years to life, just because they didn't understand the justice system and ultimately took their cases to trial not knowing what lied ahead. I spent a total of 4 years inside of a Division of Juvenile Justice, which is a prison for kids. Before I started my sentence, I had the opportunity in juvenile hall to meet one of my mentors, somebody that showed love to me when I didn't even know what love meant or what love is. And he basically embraced me and told me, I believe in you. I know you have potential. And that was the first time anybody has ever told me that in my life. I started my sentence moving forward inside the juvenile justice system. And one thing I like to point out that there was a lot of opportunities that aren't available to the youth in prison, which is a lot of the juvenile rights, which is to be able to treat you as a kid, give you the treatment that kids deserve, that is scientifically based to serve youth. A prison does not have those requirements for youth, especially kids that have trauma involved. I did say I had the opportunity to parole before 25. While being ultimately in there, my brain began to develop. I went from an immature juvenile to a kid that turned 18 years old that wanted and wants to reach his goals. And I began to see myself more differently because I began to grow maturely. I focused very hard on high school. I was the first ever in my family to receive my high school diploma. And within being incarcerated, I had the opportunity to go to college and ultimately get discharged. But when I was facing my juvenile fitness within the court system prior to getting sentenced, I was looking at 32 years to life. And at the moment, it didn't resonate with me. It didn't hit me. I ultimately didn't care. As I said earlier, I was very immature and I didn't care about no negative consequences to my actions. But since I had the opportunity to be in a juvenile facility, I began to embrace. I started learning that there's more to life than your backyard, that life is beautiful and there's opportunities out there. I paroled at the age of 19 years and a half, and I immediately went to community college and was welcomed with open arms to a community-based organization that cared for me and cares for me and embraced me with open arms, with no judgment, but with guidance, with people that have survived so much trauma. And I'm very fortunate to be a youth leader within right now in that space and advocating for my friends that I left behind incarcerated that are still in prison, that have life sentences, that unfortunately they aren't here to be able to speak in front of everybody and let you guys know that they aren't the same kids that were at the age of 14, 15, but I am here for them and I'm here to advocate on their behalf. And yes, I'm very thankful to be home. As I said, this could have went a whole different way. I could have been in prison right now and still been in prison, living that detrimental, negative, horrendous experience as everybody here on this call has stated. Yes, so thank you.
Oscar, thank you so much for sharing your story. You are an amazing example, like our other panelists, about people being able to change, redemption and hard work and opportunity. And again, you're an example of how everyone on this panel should have received age-appropriate services like you did that worked and brought you home to be a productive citizen. My next question is going to be for Preston. Preston, I was amazed by hearing, just your experience as a former prosecutor. And that's amazing story you shared about going into a juvenile hall and experiencing proximity to the people that you were holding accountable in a different time. And as you know, we have amazing Congress members, Congressmember Karen Bass, Tony Cárdenas, and Bruce Westerman, introducing this comprehensive and much, much needed reform for children. Preston, can you talk about your experience as a prosecutor and why these constitutional protections are so necessary?
Thank you, Michael. And it's just a real honor and privilege, and I'm humbled to be on here with these folks because I have been changed by hearing their stories and the stories of people like them. And as you mentioned, I started my career as a prosecutor here in Tennessee. That's why I went to law school. I believed in victims' rights. I believed in public safety. I believed in holding people accountable. And as a prosecutor here, Tennessee has the toughest sentence for first-degree murder in the country. And I had a hand in imposing that kind of sentence, 51 years mandatory, against people who were not old enough yet to drive a car. And I think that what we've settled for is an idea that justice is just about punishment. And it's about looking at a person, even someone who can't vote or serve on a jury or sign a contract, and thinking, well, there's no more to that person than the worst thing that I know about them. And that is a dangerous business to be in as a human being, to judge someone so harshly, because none of us want to be judged that way. I don't want anybody labeling me based on my worst moment. And this started to change for me when I did get involved in a college prison education initiative. And I was leading a discussion in a room full of people, some of whom again were children when they got caught up in the criminal justice system. As you've heard today, overwhelmingly, these are people who suffered trauma and violence, unlike anything that I could imagine. And that proximity, that works on a person. You can't demonize somebody whose story you have heard. When the parameters of your compassion start to expand, you start understanding that justice is not a zero-sum game in which I can only care about public safety or people who are serving these sentences. Justice is about recognizing ourselves and each other and wanting what's best for each other, wanting people to heal from trauma, wanting people to get a second chance when they show that they deserve it. And so I ended up leaving my career as a prosecutor because I was rooting for these people. I wanted to see changes like what these laws contemplate, that treat kids like kids, that are trauma informed, that hold out hope for redemption and second chances. And so now I work for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. Consider people like Eric and Abd'Allah to absolutely be my brothers in this work, and getting to know folks like Jarret and Oscar and Jerome and Michael. It is absolutely life-changing when you start to think about justice, not in terms of throwing people away as if that's how we would want to be treated, but in terms of holding out hope for redemption for the most vulnerable members of our society who can become our most valuable resources for building a better future. So that's why I think, as a former prosecutor and somebody who now I think I'm starting to understand this issue much better, thanks to people like this, that's why it's so important to get this done.
Thank you so much, Preston, for sharing that experience. I know Eric and we're so grateful to be working with you, and just ensuring that we encourage others to learn from that experience of proximity and getting to know the issues, especially around children. So thank you for the work that you're doing and that you will continue to do, Preston. Next, I have the privilege and such an amazing opportunity to introduce one of our authors of the bills, representing the 37th District of California, a district that I just moved into down in
Oh, welcome.
And I moved into this district on purpose, Congressmember. But I wanted to introduce everyone, Congressmember Karen Bass. Welcome, Congressmember.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. And I know, life here on the Hill is crazy. And so I'm running from one place to the other. But Heather on my staff has shared with me some of the pieces of your stories. And I really appreciated listening to Mr. Shipp talking about what he did before and what he's doing now. And it's so critical because your voice really can't be disputed. Whereas some of us who are involved in these reform movements are questioned. And the fact that you were a prosecutor, I think, puts you in a special category. And I know I want to continue to stay connected because we need that voice. I just have some basic fundamental beliefs. And my beliefs are that children are children. And when I look at our juvenile justice system, it's hard for me to use the word justice. The problem is, and all of you know far better than me, why is it that it's just certain categories? It's just certain categories. If you are wealthy, and we have some stories, actually, not from my district, Michael, and welcome. I'll look forward to seeing you at some of our events. But, there are many examples of wealthy young people committing crimes, and they're viewed as troubled teens. No one talks about throwing them away. And usually if their parents have enough money to purchase the resources, the counseling or whatever they need, well, then that's an alternative. And I think probably the most egregious case was the guy that the judge said he suffered from affluenza. He was wealthy. He was the young man who he was a boy. He killed, I think it was 2 or 3 of his of his peers in an accident, and he did no time at all because the judge said, well, the reason why he had this problem is because he was from a wealthy family, and we needed to understanding that would have never been consideration, that would have never been given to you all. And so when it breaks down on race and class, then you have to question the overall system. And now I don't think there's any excuse for it, because we have the scientific knowledge to know about the young brain, and to know that the young brain does not completely mature in terms of decisions until you're in your mid-20s. And then after that, if you look at the cycle of crime, when people are older, they, the risky behaviors or whatever they were doing when they were young, not goes away, but you understand what I'm saying, it's different. And so how can you judge a young person and throw them away for life? I just can't comprehend it. I do know there's a small percentage of young people who might be sociopaths or have something overwhelming like that. But that's a very small percentage. If you look at someone's life in total and see what their experiences have been, the traumas that they've been through, you put anybody in that circumstance, and why would you be surprised that they, participated in criminal activity? So it's been a long road to get where we are now in our country that has led to mass incarceration. But I remember in the late 80s and 90s, this is when I became obsessed over this and started Community Coalition in 1990, because it was obvious we were going to have mass incarceration. We were watching the laws pass, and we passed the law in California that reduced the age. So we want to rectify some of that now. I wish we could go much further. I frankly think we need to evaluate the entire juvenile justice system, because I think the entire system needs to be transformed, and it needs to focus on the 5% or whatever percentage it is of kids whose criminality is involved in a mental illness. They're sociopaths, antisocial behavior. And then the majority of young people, we need to deal with the root causes, are the social and the economic conditions that led to what happened. And that's the type of transformation that's needed. Now, in the meantime, I do want to fight for incremental change, but I wanted to start by talking about the sweeping change that needs to take place, because the incremental changes are just baby steps. And really, from my point of view, they're baby steps to begin to get some of my colleagues to understand that why don't you treat a teen that's in trouble exactly the way you would treat your own kid? Because your kids get in trouble too. And you take care of it because of who you are, the money you have, and your status in society. You can navigate your troubled teen. So why do you want to throw the troubled teens away in my neighborhood? And so the baby steps, so the legislation that we're doing, the Childhood Offenders Rehabilitation and Safety Act, is trying to look at children under 16, trying children under 16 as adults, in children being held in adult jails and prisons, childhood trauma leading up to incarceration. We know about the pathways that result in people being incarcerated. How do we disrupt those pathways? So just know that when I am involved in this legislation, it's with the long-term strategy. And by the way, I will always use the term children, because I think it's really important not to call somebody who's 13 or 14 years old a young man or a young woman. They're a child. And science, demonstrates that. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And just know that I consider this my life's work. And I work on a lot of issues here, but they're all related. Whether I'm working on foster care or reentry services for people that have been incarcerated, it's all interconnected. How do we disrupt the pathway to prison pipeline?
Congressmember, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here, to advocate as our leader, not just in California, but across the country, sitting in Congress. We are very, very excited to have you leading on this bill, and we just can't wait to continue to move forward. So thank you so much for your advocacy. your dedication, and your truth.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. I'm going to run on to the next thing, but no, I'm always there with you. I might not be there physically, but you're my purpose for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so there you have it. There's part of our discussion today, really revolving around treating kids like kids and why Congress must prioritize criminal justice reform for children. And at this moment, we really want to take some time to field any questions that myself, Eric, or my colleagues on this call can ask and answer. So if there are any questions from the staff and the media, we'd love to answer any questions and dive in further for the last few minutes that we have of this discussion. And Derek, I don't know if you just want to continue to move things along as we look at what questions we have. I know James is going to be sending some our way.
And if folks who do have questions, if you can just either raise your hand or put it in the chat function, we can make sure that those get to Michael and to Eric. And we'll give folks maybe a few minutes, Michael, and then if there's no questions, maybe you and Eric can continue with some of the follow-up you have.
Yes, while we wait on questions, I have a question for the panelists. How did you overcome the traumatic experience of incarceration and become the person that you are today? And anyone can take this.
So one of the things that I did, so I was given life without the possibility of parole. I had to really look at that sentence and break it down, because for a long time I didn't understand what life without the possibility of parole meant. Once I understood what that meant, I had to redefine what that sentence meant. And it was a lie. And it was a lie because it said that I was irredeemable and that I wasn't capable of being a productive, contributing member of society. What I did, I had to say that's a lie because I am the truth, because I am possible. So I really just had to go inward, even in that traumatic state, and find a way to come out whole and complete, because there was no one else while I was inside of prison that was caring for me as a child. So I really just had to really depend on myself.
Thank you. Abd'Allah.
Yeah, I think that Jarret mentioned earlier, and I think it's important to just allow us to sit with it for a moment when he said that there's a level of traumatization from that entire experience that is present and ongoing. And so it isn't as if those experiences magically disappear as you walk out of the prison doors. And so while we're talking about what it was that allowed us to get through, speaking for myself, I think that the simple truth of it is what the United States Supreme Court has already recognized, which is that children are different, the behaviors are transient. And so as we matured, process of natural maturation into our adulthood, there was transition and transformation that took place. Some of that just happened through that natural process, but then added to that access to education, having some spiritual foundation, and just chronological age. You begin to do the things that adults do. The moral moorings begin to take shape in your life in meaningful ways, and you try to create every opportunity to manifest meaning, purpose, and value within your life and the people around you, despite what your circumstances are. And for a time, that gives you a sense of purpose and value. But I can also say that in my own instance and several people who I knew personally, when we're talking about decades later, 30, 40 years later, in some cases, as much as 50 years later, no matter what your achievements are, educational, spiritual, how you give back to your immediate community and your community outside, it gets to the point where you have to ask yourself, why continue? When does the punishment ever end? And some of my colleagues' personal close friends answered that by taking their own lives. So I know 3 people personally who couldn't survive and took their own lives because they just couldn't imagine enduring another second, let alone another day, another year, another decade. So that trauma that I think we've experienced personally and through our childhood, our incarceration, and then to some extent after our release is still there. It doesn't indicate that we're a danger, but it does speak to just not only the resilience that is exhibit amongst all of us, but it also speaks to, like, with the proper care, the proper treatment, the proper counseling, look at the amazing things that we have the ability to accomplish on our own, even without resources. So imagine if we did have resources. Imagine if those people who we have left behind had support and had opportunity and had hope and purpose, what they could achieve within their own lives and what they can achieve for their families, their communities, and our society at large. So yeah, it's an ongoing process in terms of our readjustment, our growth, and our development. But I don't want to say that it was prison or hope that allowed us to get through. For the grace of God, there go I. And I could be literally in the ground because I reached that stage where I couldn't endure another day, another week, another year.
Abd'Allah, Oscar, Preston, Jarret, Eric, thank you all so much. James Dold, our amazing partner behind the scenes, working his magic on Zoom. Thank you. This was an amazing conversation, one that I personally have been waiting to desperately have externally for everyone to hear your amazing stories of what it was like to really survive these situations from such a young age. I've always been wanting to hear that society was wrong, that we weren't super predators at 13, 14, 15 years old, that we were kids, misguided, hurt, traumatized, just trying to figure things out. And here we are decades later, just telling our truth of why we should treat children as children. So I'm humbled and deeply honored to have shared this space with all of you. We do hope that everyone who listened has the opportunity to look up these individuals and their amazing stories, and help support our bills moving forward, authored by Congress members Tony Cárdenas, Karen Bass, and Bruce Westerman. You all have the power to call your elected officials, find out who they are, and tell them the priorities that matter to you and that should matter to all of us, regardless if you're a Democrat or Republican. And that's the issue of children, and making sure that this country steps up to the level that we are supposed to as leaders and as examples of how we are protecting our future generations. So with that, I just am deeply grateful and honored to have had this conversation with all of you, and we'll hopefully tune in next time. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining.